Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating, complex, and honestly pretty heavy historical evolution of a single word. If you're studying history, sociology, or media, you already know that language doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? It evolves. And sometimes it gets weaponized. So we're going to neutrally and comprehensively unpack the entire arc of the Jezebel label.
To kick things off, I want you to think about your own family history or lived experiences for a second. Has an older relative, maybe your grandmother or someone from a previous generation, ever actually directed this word at you?
Or maybe you've just overheard it used in passing to describe someone else. You know, it's one of those words that just stubbornly lingers in our cultural vocabulary, often thrown around in casual conversation without a second thought.
But do you even know what the word really means? Uncovering its true origins actually reveals a profound lesson in intersectional history and media literacy. It's not just some dusty old insult. It's a linguistic artifact that has mutated dramatically over centuries. By the end of this explainer, you'll see exactly why historical context is absolutely vital to the words we use today.
Here's how we're breaking it down today. 1. The weight of a word. 2. The biblical queen Jezebel. 3. A metaphor for manipulation. 4. The harmful racial stereotype. And 5. Modern slang and reclamation.
Let's jump right into section 1. The weight of a word.
If we literally map out this word's arc, we can see exactly how different eras weaponized or altered the term for their own unique sociological purposes. It actually starts in antiquity as a literal biblical figure, becomes a broad cultural archetype centuries later, morphs into a manufactured racial stereotype during the grim reality of the Jim Crow era, and finally arrives at today, where it exists as modern slang. It's quite a journey.
Moving to section 2, the biblical queen Jezebel.
So, in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Kings, Jezebel wasn't just a concept. She was an actual living person. She was a fierce Phoenician princess who married Ahab, the king of Israel. Now, as queen, she adamantly promoted the worship of our native gods, Baal and Asherah. And, as you can imagine, this created a massive religious and political clash with the Hebrew God and the local prophets. But it was her actions that really cemented her legacy. She was portrayed as ruthlessly manipulative, controlling, and violent in her pursuit of power. Most famously, she orchestrated the execution of an innocent man named Naboth, literally just to steal his vineyard for her husband.
And her demise? Well, it reads like a dramatic true crime narrative, and it is incredibly visceral. According to the text, she was overthrown and defenestrated, which is a fancy historical word for being literally thrown out of a high window, by her very own servants. Her body was then left in the streets where it was eaten by stray dogs, fulfilling a pretty grim prophecy laid out by the prophet Elijah. This dramatic, violent end really sealed her name in history, not just as a monarch, but as a definitive warning.
All right, section 3, a metaphor for manipulation.
Because of that intense biblical depiction, over the centuries, the name totally transformed from a historical person into a broad behavioral trope. Religious and literary contexts started using her name to define a very specific type of behavior. Calling someone a Jezebel implied they were scheming, deceptive, or power-hungry. In fact, in some theological circles today, you'll still hear the phrase Jezebel spirit. This describes an entity or a person who is maliciously controlling, manipulative, or who uses seduction and charm to deliberately subvert traditional authority. Basically, the proper noun became a shorthand for deceit.
Which brings us to section 4, the harmful racial stereotype.
During the eras of slavery and Jim Crow, the word underwent a massive, calculated shift here in America. The Jezebel caricature was intentionally manufactured by white society as a racist stereotype. It was used to falsely depict black women as inherently hypersexual, seductive, and untrustworthy. Now, as students of history and sociology, we have to ask the critical question: why was this done? Well, it was engineered specifically to justify the systemic sexual exploitation, abuse, and assault of black women. By falsely framing them as the aggressors, society intentionally stripped them of the legal and moral protections that were, at that time, exclusively granted to white women.
And sociology and media studies document this dynamic so clearly. You see, the Jezebel trope didn't just exist in a vacuum. It functioned as a direct historical counter-archetype to the mammy caricature. These weren't just accidental labels, guys. They were carefully constructed media archetypes that served a highly specific role in maintaining systemic abuse in social hierarchies. Understanding this binary is absolutely vital to grasping the deep sociological scars this word carries in American history.
Finally, let's look at section 5, modern slang and reclamation.
Today, the usage of the word is entirely split depending on your context.
On one hand, in modern secular conversation, it definitely remains an old-fashioned, often dramatic insult aimed at a woman perceived as deceitful, opportunistic, or overly promiscuous. But on the other hand, we're actually witnessing active reclamation. In modern pop culture and feminist spaces, the archetype is being flipped completely on its head. In this specific context, being called a Jezebel is subverted to describe a fiercely independent woman, one who refuses to submit to traditional expectations and who owns her power, her agency, and her sexuality unapologetically. It's a fascinating linguistic pivot.
To wrap up our explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to analyze. Knowing the deep, complex, and honestly painful history of this word, how does it change the way you view its use? When you hear this casual slang moving forward, whether it's thrown as an insult or worn as a badge of empowerment, how will your new understanding of its intersectional history shape what you hear? Language is incredibly powerful, and knowing its roots is the real key to true media literacy. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the words around you.